All right. Welcome to the first ever YouTube episode of the Software Speaker Podcast, or video channel, if you want to call it. This is a show designed to help engineers become better communicators. And I have the great pleasure of introducing to you my very first guest. This is a gentleman who I've been following for a long time. And I'm absolutely floored that he's accepted my invitation to be on the show. Clive Maxfield is a freelance technical consultant and writer. Over the years, Max has designed everything from silicon chips to steampunk prognostication engines. He's going to explain what that is in a minute, I hope. Well known throughout the embedded systems and IoT industries, Max has presented papers at numerous technical conferences around the world and is the author of a number of books, including Bebop to the Boolean Boogie, An Unconventional Guide to Electronics. And in addition, just to add something to that, the very first book I got from Max is this one. Oh,
Designers Maximus.
Designers Maximus, Unleashed, and then at the bottom it says Banned in Alabama. So without further ado, the great Maxfield.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me on.
It is truly a pleasure. And when I said I've been following you for a long time. I started following your columns back when there were still print magazines, if you remember those.
I remember those days.
Yes. And I can't remember, I think it was EE Times or Embedded Systems. I can't remember which one, but that was back when I was doing FPGA design, hence when I got that book. And I've been following you ever since. You have a great blog right now. It's a really great series on the introduction to electronics. And I really like it. If you get a chance, check it out. But I like the fact that you're doing all your drawings yourself. I'm assuming that you hand draw those.
Yeah.
It's a great series, and it's accessible to everyone, which is one of the reasons that I thought to reach out to you, because you are one of the few people that I've met, engineers, that actually make engineering fun. One of the reasons I like your book so much is because it's actually humorous, it's funny. And to take a topic like FPGA design and to make it funny and entertaining, that's a very unique skill set. And so,
well, thank you so much.
It's amazing. So the first thing, I guess, for those of you people out there who may not be familiar with you, when you read someone's writing, you kind of get a feel for who they are, but listening to you, your accent, you can tell, as we say here in the South, you ain't from around these here parts. So if you wouldn't mind.
The first thing they told me to say when I got down to Alabama was "damn Yankees."
So if you don't mind, just give us a bit of a background. Where is your original home?
Oh, well, born and bred in Sheffield, Yorkshire.
Okay.
Yorkshire is the biggest county in England. In the same way the States has got 50, the United States has got 50 states.
Uh-huh.
England has got, I think, about 50 counties. I'm not quite sure of the exact number.
Okay.
And it's almost like everything is crammed in very tightly, of course. So England is about the size of Alabama, but Alabama's got a population of about 4.5 million. And England, if you take Scotland as well, is more like 60 million or more. Wow. So there's an awful lot in a short space. And in the same way that in America, like you've got the Boston accent is different to the Californian accent, yes. But it's sort of very big areas. You know, the northeast is one accent, the south, of course, and then the west coast. So you can tell people from the extremes, but the rest, Midwest, I suppose. In England, every county has got a distinct accent, and every big city. So if someone comes from Birmingham in England, to my ear, it's very nasally Birmingham, and I can spot them a mile away. And if someone comes from Liverpool or Newcastle-on-Tyne, it's a very sing-song accent. It's almost like they're wanting to sing while they're talking. And so Yorkshire's got a strong accent in its own right. to the extent that people from outside of Yorkshire can, especially North Yorkshire, the Dales, can find it hard to tell what people are saying. Sheffield has got its own accent. It's very, very strong. It's like Yorkshire on steroids. So broad Sheffield is almost unintelligible to anyone who's not from there. My mother was... Well, I will in a minute. My mother was brought up in one of the poorer areas of Sheffield. I mean, they had nothing but the pride, essentially.
Okay.
I mean, outside toilets, one cold water tap to the house. No kitchen. The big stove that heated the house was in the front room.
Okay.
There was 2 rooms downstairs, but one you never used. What you call a family room here, was only for weddings, funerals, and christenings. I mean, it was ridiculous. They had nothing, but they had the best of what they hadn't got was in that room. And so they all crammed into one little room, maybe 12 by 14 feet. They had a tin bath, but it was kept in the basement. They brought it up once a week. They heated the water on the stove in the front room, filled the bath. In the house was my mother's grandfather, so my great-grandfather, her mother and father, herself, a sister, and a brother.
Wow.
So the grandfather had 1 bedroom. The mother and father and my mother and her sister had the other room, and my uncle was in the freezing cold attic on top.
Wow.
And they spoke with a broad Sheffield accent. So when I grew up, my grandfather would say things like, he'd say tint int tin, which means it isn't tint in the int tin. Tin. Tin, tin, tin. So tin is tin, tin, tin. And I'd hear it as it isn't in the tin. Or he'd say to me, by gum lad, that rattles like a can of mabs. Meaning you make a noise like a can of marbles being shaken and rattling. So this is how my mother grew up, and my Aunt Shirley still talks that way. Well, so the funny thing is that my grandmother was deaf. She went deaf at 19 from scarlet fever or something or other.
Sorry.
But unlike when somebody's born deaf, they can learn to speak, but sometimes they have a very mechanical accent. And it's unfortunate that people, out of all the different afflictions you can get, if somebody is born deaf and talks with that accent, everyone else thinks they're stupid, which is so far from the truth. It's amazing. But because my grandmother was 19 years old when she went deaf, so she already knew how to speak, as a kid, I didn't even know she was deaf. All I knew is that to attract her attention, you had to pull a skirt, and then she'd turn around. Once she turned around, she could lip read. So I didn't know she was deaf at all, because I was only a little lad. But in the war, my grandfather was away in the Royal Navy, busily being sunk in every ocean known to man. He was sunk more. He could win the Guinness Book of Records for being sunk and surviving.
It's terrible.
Well, the amazing thing is that none of the sailors learnt to swim. They didn't want to, because their view was if you were sunk, the chances of being rescued in those days, because you didn't have all the equipment we have now, was very slim. And rather than swimming around, floating around for maybe 24 hours before being eaten by sharks, they'd rather drown and have it done with it.
Wow.
So he couldn't swim, but like I say, he was sunk many times, but it was always near a piece of wood or something. And later on in life, I once went to him, I was about 8 years old, I was building a rope ladder or something, and I said to him, "Grandad, can I borrow your knife?" And he whipped it out, and he was paralysed by this time down one side, and he opened it with his teeth and gave it to me and said, "Be careful, son, it's sharp." And I went out and tried to cut a piece of rope, and it was like a razor, because he just sat there all day sharpening the thing. And I went back in and I said, "Grandad, why is your knife so sharp?" And he looked at me and he said, "Having a sharp knife has saved my life more times than I care to remember." And I remembered my mother telling me about him being sunk and being pulled down by ropes and getting his knife and cutting the ropes away and floating to the top and grabbing a piece of wood. And when you looked at it, when he was saying that, you could see he wasn't with me. He was thinking back to those far off times. It was the weirdest thing.
Wow.
So anyway, my mother, he was away at war. My mother was 9 years old at the beginning of the war. They didn't have electricity in the house, I think 1943, when her grandfather died, because he wouldn't have that modern newfangled stuff in the house. My grandmother used to stick sticky tape over the unused, they only got 2 outlets, but the one they weren't using, to stop electricity leaking out, because they had gas lights and gas leaked out. So she thought electricity would leak too.
And yeah.
So they got a radio, and my mother's job at 12 years old was to listen to the radio and then tell my grandmother what was happening in the war.
Okay.
And listening to the posh BBC announcers on the radio, my mother thought, I am never going to get a decent job speaking the way I do.
Right.
So she taught herself to speak posh
Okay.
by listening to the radio, which is why I don't speak broad Sheffield. I don't speak posh in English terms, but I don't speak broad Sheffield. And now that she's retired, I mean, she's 90 years old this year, but her greatest fun is being on the radio, listening to the extreme left politicians, all for the working class. And she's as working class as you can get. And she talks with a posh accent. She'll lead them on. You know, so am I to understand that you're saying, and can I take it that you are promising to? And she leads them down a path, and then she'll switch to broad Sheffield. And it's like, by gum, lad, I must think I'm stupid. You know, Dad, you're a liar. Your dad was a liar, and his dad before him. I remember when you said 10 years ago. And they're like, what's happening?
That's awesome.
Well, everyone's got to have a hobby, and it keeps her busy.
Absolutely. So growing up in England, what on earth brought you to Alabama?
I got the short straw.
Okay.
Well, it's funny. I've been very lucky in my life, to be honest with you. I mean, I had great parents. There was never any shouting in our house, which has left me totally incapable to have arguments with people, because I've never had any practice. I don't know how to do it. I didn't even know my parents disagreed about anything till I was 18. Now, in hindsight, you can look back and you think, yes, there were occasions when there were frigid silences. But there was never any shouting or banging around. My father never raised his voice or his hand to me. If he was disappointed in me, I knew it. You know, a feeling pervaded the house, like when I swapped the sugar for salt, and he had 2 spoons in his coffee, and he drank the whole cup without saying a word, but the gloom descended. Again, I was only about probably 8 years old, and, you know, every time he took a sip of his coffee, the joke got less funny. And he didn't say a word. And I went into the kitchen, and my mother was washing the pots. And without turning round, she said, I don't know what you've done, but until you apologise to your dad, it's not going to stop. And she could feel it from the kitchen.
Oh, my God.
And so I went back in the front room and said, I'm sorry, Dad. And he looked round from his newspaper, and he said, don't do that again, son. And the gloom lifted. The sun came through the windows. The birds started singing again.
Oh, that is awesome.
And that was like the worst discipline I ever had. Yeah. But like I say, not hearing people shout, or they'd had an agreement before I was born, no arguing in front of the kids.
Okay. And
incredibly, they kept it up. So, and they were an interesting couple. You know, it's, I think you wanted to talk about electronics.
Well,
I think it's an amazing story because I think, I can't remember, I think I was about 18. I'd already moved out of the house because I was at university. And I'd come back to visit, and the German U-boat program, Das Boot, was on TV.
Okay.
And it was in German with English subtitles. My dad was reading his paper, my mother was knitting, and it was on TV. And they said something, and my mother happened to glance up and saw the subtitles, and she said, it doesn't mean that, does it, Reg? And he looked up and he said, no, it means, and he said something in German. And I was like, do you both speak German? Yes. I was like, you never mentioned it, you never asked. I mean, and that was just like, you know, typical, you know.
You never asked.
Well, it turned out that's how they'd met, because my dad was in the, well, obviously he was in, well, before the war, he was on the stage with his two brothers as three dancers in vaudeville or variety hall.
Really? Wow.
And they started at like 14 years old or something. So 14-year-old boys traveling England. I mean, they were away for like months at a time with the whole cast. You know, on Sunday morning, you get on a train, you go to a new town. Sunday afternoon, you'd be unpacking. Monday morning, setting up and practicing. Monday night, on with the show sort of thing. And they did that right up to the Second World War. And they could have carried on as an act and just gone around playing to the soldiers. But they decided they wanted to do their part. So they each went in different directions. My Uncle Sid got killed in a prisoner of war camp in Italy. You know, I believe he was beaten to death, you know, for something, probably complaining about food. My dad was in reconnaissance, and he was badly shot up behind the German lines. And apparently, so my mother showed me this letter, this German girl, who was, or Belgian girl maybe, who was about 18 years old and apparently incredibly beautiful, dragged him unconscious to the farmhouse, and her and her grandmother stuffed him in the cellar and kept him for a week until the English lines rolled over. Now, if the Germans had found him, he would have been treated fairly and sent off to a prisoner of war camp. Yeah. They would have been executed.
Yeah.
So incredibly brave and everything.
Yeah, absolutely.
So my mother's got this letter that this German girl had written to him after the war, saying something like, "Dear Tommy, when I first saw you, you were covered in mud and blood, and I kissed you." And my mother said, "So if your dad had been awake, you'd have been a Belgian boy by now." So after the war, my dad went to learn German lessons. He stayed in Germany after the war for a bit. He ran it was in Hamburg, and I think there was some sort of camp that the Germans had built that they actually then kept the German prisoners in when they were brought to the, not Hamburg, Nuremberg, to the Nuremberg trials.
Mm-hmm.
So my dad was in charge of that camp.
Oh, wow.
Looking after them and then making sure they got to the trials and everything. And then he came back and he wanted to learn more German. So he hired a German lady in England. Yeah, she'd lived there through the war. There was an old German lady and he was paying for private lessons. Meanwhile, my mother had got a pen pal boyfriend called Benny in Holland, I think. And he spoke German. So she went to the same lady to learn German. And one lady, they both got there and they'd been paying for private lessons, and they were both there and they're like, "What's happening? We're paying for private lessons." She said, "Oh, I want you to practice on each other." Cunning Germans. And yeah, after a few lessons, they were dating each other.
Too bad for Benny.
Yes, and for whatever the lady's name was.
The young Belgian lady.
Good luck for me, obviously.
Absolutely.
Oh, so you're asking how I got to Alabama. So when I left university with my degree in control engineering, my first position was with a company called International Computers Limited, ICL.
Okay.
Which is sort of like the UK equivalent of IBM, but obviously way smaller. Okay. But they still made some very big advances in the early days of computing and everything. And I was on a team of, I was a junior member, obviously, of a team creating CPUs for mainframe computers.
Okay.
And then two of the managers left and they formed their own company and invited me to join them. And so I think I was number 6 in. And I arrived the day after the desks and chairs. So everyone else said I was really lucky. And I always thought we were a really small company because I just kept my head down, just working away. And I think it was 10 years later, there were 2 sister companies. And the other one was an offshoot from Brunel University. And they created the high-low simulator, which was one of the very first logic simulators. The guy who created Verilog, Phil Morby, he was part of the high-low team.
Okay.
And I got into the simulation side of things, and from there started going around the world giving training courses and stuff. And then a company over here in Huntsville, Intergraph. This was the time when all of the tools were command line. So black and white monitors, and you typed in your Unix commands and ran things in batch mode and so on. Intergraph made these big color monitors. Their advert was the 27-inch Advantage. And, you know, to complement the monitor, you had to buy a workstation off them for about $40,000. And they did lots of software of their own. And again, if you bought one of their software packages, then you had to buy a computer to run it on from them. But what they did was for a lot of people, was go out to other companies that had good software like us and run the software on their machines, but put a graphical user interface on it. Okay. So if we wanted to create a test waveform, you'd say at time 1000, make this signal a logic 1, make this signal a logic 0, all in text.
Wow.
And then you'd run, and that would be your test vectors that you'd run through the simulation. They would take that file, if you got one, and create it into a waveform diagram. Or they'd let you draw the waveform diagram and press the button and generate the file. So you could they got a schematic capture package, so you could generate the netlist, you could draw the waveforms, press the go button, and it did everything behind the scenes to run our software and then give you the results. And they were doing that for all these different tools, RF tools and analog tools and everything. And they were bidding for a big contract with Sandia National Laboratories. And so they said to all the companies who were supplying them, can you send somebody over to answer questions while we're doing this big contract bid? And my company sent me, said, don't take a suit, you'll never meet a customer, just hang out by the pool. And every now and again, somebody will come down and ask you a stupid question and you tell them the answer and they'll go away again. But you can't really do that. I mean, when I got there, I introduced myself to everyone, found out that they had to create an ASIC cell library and they'd never done one before for simulation. And so I said, give me a workstation, you know, with the VI editor and the specification and leave me to it. And it was 3 weeks of 18-hour days, but tremendous fun. And at the end of it, they said, you know, have you ever thought about working for Intergraph? And I said, no. And they said, start thinking. And 6 weeks later, I was here.
Wow.
It was really funny because when you go for a new job, everyone always says it's one of the tense parts of your life. You know, going into a new firm, not knowing anybody and everything else. But because this contract bid had been mounted in Albuquerque, New Mexico, mm-hmm. And basically Intergraph had taken 2 floors of a hotel over. One floor, they'd taken all the furniture out of one floor and filled it with computers and things. And the other floor was where we all slept. And we might be working till 2 in the morning and then we'd go and play golf or something. We were young, you know, 30 years old, and then come back, crash out for a few hours and then get up and meet the customers and start all over again. It was a great experience, probably one of the better ones of my life, work-wise. And so when I actually came here to Huntsville and walked in for the first day, I knew everybody. They're all going, hello, Max, how are you doing? You got your office here? And it was just like old home week. So, yeah, there's no pain or anything, you know, just straight into the job.
Nice. And I'm sure you had the personality to adapt to everybody. I'm sure that helped a lot.
Well, it's like I told you before, the trick is to get me to stop talking. Now people run the other way when they see me coming. Oh no, not another story.
No, those are good stories. So most people would have stopped there. Okay, I've got a job, I'm an engineer, but you transitioned into writing. Tell me about how you went from just doing engineering into writing.
Well, again, it's sort of a bit of a weird thing, really. It started off with a simulation company. I really loved simulation. I've heard from people who didn't come from a hardware. I was always a hardware logic designer. So not an analog designer. To me, that's a bit of a mystery, but digital logic, loved it.
Yeah.
With a digital simulator, if you're a C programmer, you think of things typically, if you forget multi-cores and threads and things, you think of things as happening sequentially.
Yes.
Do this, do this, do this. And if you've got two variables, like variable A that contains 6 and variable B that contains 3, if somewhere you say, make variable A equal to variable B, and then on the next line, make variable B equal to variable A, you'll end up with the same thing in both variables.
Mm.
With a hardware description language, unless you tell it not to, it'll do things concurrently.
Right.
So if you declare a register called A with 4 bits and a register called B with 4 bits and give them different contents, and at some time you say, when the clock rises, make register A equal to register B and make register B equal to register A, they will swap over because that's the way it happens in hardware. Mm-hmm. And software people coming from a software background find it hard to wrap their brains around that. But coming from a hardware background, it seemed pretty obvious to me. So I got into the simulation side, and then I started seeing things I didn't like with the software we were writing. So I would write a note to the engineering team saying, when you press this button, it doesn't work right. And they'd send a message back saying, we haven't got a clue what you're talking about. So then I'd explain it a bit more, and they'd say, no, still no idea. And eventually it was like, if you press this button, this is what you see on the screen. Here's a screenshot. This is not what you should see on the screen. What you should see on the screen is this. And they go, oh, now we understand. We agree and we'll do it. And so that was the beginning of it, really, sort of just practicing communicating by writing. And then the company said, oh, we've got an opportunity for a magazine article. Can you write it for us? And so that was my first article. And then when I came over here to the States, I don't really know how it came about, but I ended up, so Intergraph was a big company, so they had good relations with magazines and things. And somehow they said, oh, we've got this opportunity to do like a monthly article for EDN, Electronic Design News.
Yes, yes.
And so I started doing, those are the articles that are gathered in that book, The Designers Maximus Unleashed. So those were basically just monthly articles on simulation or linear feedback shift registers. I think I did one on genetic algorithms. And
yes.
And so, basically just writing that way, and I got to like it. And then I wrote the book Bebop to the Boolean Boogie. And I think that it wasn't a joke or anything. It's just I read a lot. I've shown you around the office with the camera. I read lots and lots of books, mostly science fiction, but technical books as well. And typically technical books bore the socks off me.
Yes.
Yeah, I hate it when somebody, the first page says, as we all know, and then gives me 3 pages of equations. And I'm sat there going, well, I didn't know that. So I'm lost from the get-go. And one Saturday morning I guess it was 92, I woke up on a Saturday. I was thinking of going to the bookstore to get, look a route around, see what was there. Mm-hmm. And I was lying in bed. I thought it'd be fun to go down to a bookstore and see a book I'd written on the shelf. So I started writing Bebop. One of the few things I knew about was electronics. So, but I wanted to write a book that, when I was a student, I got 50 books and I couldn't find the fact I was looking for in any of them. So I wanted a book where you could find the facts. It had everything, lots of nuggets of knowledge, tidbits of trivia, and also decent index. I always do my own indexes because I hate it when I read a book, say there's something, I don't know, about, it could be, again, genetic algorithms, but they mention a green parrot as part of the narrative. 6 months later, I can't remember exactly what the topic was, but I remember there's a green parrot involved. And if I go to the index and I turn to the index and I look up green parrot or parrot comma green, and it gives me a page, and I go to that page and I'm where I want to be. The green parrot's a bit of an extreme example, but the thing is that I think of things grouped in where I read them. And often when you go to a technical book and you go to the index at the back, it's like 2 pages. The book's 800 pages long, and there's 2 pages of index. Because they've just given you the very barest things, and I like to cross-reference everything. So memory might have 20 subjects like ROM, RAM, SRAM, but then they will each have their own SRAM, ROM, RAM. Lots of ways to get to where you're going. Anyway, that was before the internet arrived, or before the internet as we know it arrived. So I spent 2 years of evenings and weekends in the local library with the Encyclopedia Britannica, just for dates. I mean, like, when did George Boole live? You couldn't check it on the internet. You had to be in the library. Yeah. After 2 years, I emerged with a manuscript and found a publisher and sent it off. And thought, right, I'll watch TV, and turned it on. And after about half an hour, I was like, oh my God, I'm going to go insane if I keep doing this. So, I wrote the second book, and it just went on from there, really.
Wow.
And also, I mean, I was really fortunate because, well, my mother still can't believe that I make my living writing, because I showed no aptitude whatsoever for it at school or at university. So the writing started, like I say, with the magazine articles, then the books. And you don't make a lot of money out of technical books. It's never going to be on the New York Times bestseller list. So if I think about the amount of time I spent writing the books compared to the financial return, it's a very, it's not a very good proposition. It doesn't make my mother very happy. Every time she gets a new one, she puts it on the shelf. Never actually read them, of course. And it gives you a chance to dedicate them to, your closest family and friends and things. But it also opens doors. I mean, like Bebop to the Boolean Boogie. I know it sounds like a daft title, but it covers a huge amount of ground. I mean, it covers analog and digital and PCBs and hybrids and ceramics and, what's the difference between a system house and a fabless house, and it explains a huge amount of stuff. I don't know if it still is, but it used to be required reading at Cadence for the sales and marketing teams.
Nice.
They actually had a weekly get-together where one of them had been delegated to go and read a chapter and then come back and, present the chapter and explain it and everything, which I thought was awe-inspiring when I first heard that. It was very surreal to me, but it does open doors. So when I first started off as a freelance writer, there's lots of companies who've not heard of you, and so somebody, a PR person would come to you and say, "Oh, we've got an opportunity to write an article for a magazine under somebody else's name." Under their name, but they want someone to write it, so they'd introduce you to the company, and the first thing the company was very suspicious. How do we know you can actually write this for us? And the problem was that in the past they'd hired writers who had degrees in English literature and who could have written books on the use of the apostrophe or the semicolon. And so they go to them, "Can you write us a book on artificial intelligence and augmented reality?" And they go, "Yes." What is artificial intelligence and augmented reality? Well, that's true of almost any part of engineering. Can you write something on radiation effects and FPGAs? Yes. What's radiation? What's an FPGA? And by the time you've explained it to them, you could have written it yourself, which is what usually happens. You end up writing it yourself and then getting them to do the copy editing and put the commas in the right places. So having an engineer who can write it's a nice little niche, actually. I mean, there's lots of brilliant engineers in the world. I mean, most of them could out-engineer me under the table any day of the week, but so they can create the most amazing things. And then the boss will come to them and say, "Write an article for it, or write me a brochure, or write me a user manual." And they'll look at this blank screen that the day before was full of the most incredible circuit diagrams and logic and everything else. And they look at this blank screen and it's like, ah! So I can come along and I can talk to the marketing people first and say, "What's your intended audience? And what are the things you really want to push about this?" And then I can go and talk to the engineering teams and they'll try to baffle me and I'll go, "Hang on a minute ago you said this, but now you're saying this. And that doesn't work with that." And it's like, "Oh, yeah. Or they might say, we came up, this is a classical problem, and this is the usual solution, but we came up with this really good approach that no one else has done. And I go, have you told the marketing people that? They go, no, why? Would they be interested? It's like, of course they'd be interested. So having a foot in the marketing camps and when I came over to Intergraph, I'm a digital guy. They just decided to buy Daisy, one of the early CAE companies. There was Daisy, Mentor and Valid at the time, I think. And Intergraph were going to buy Daisy. So I came over as the digital expert and was made the analog marketing manager. So I had to learn all the analog tools as well. But such is life. And then the Intergraph started sending me around to speak at conferences and things. Because it's like there's a big conference and it's going to be in Taiwan and then China and then Korea. So it's 3 days here, 3 days there, 3 days there. We want you to write a paper and present it. And basically, I was given free rein to pick a subject and write the paper and everything.
Nice.
And I remember the first time I stood on the stage, I tried to look calm and everything, but behind the podium, my knees were like that. But you get used to it. And now, I mean, I know people who are terrified of public speaking.
Yes. Yeah.
They don't mind being at a party with their friends, but put them on a stage.
Yeah.
I've literally seen an editor of a magazine paralyzed with fear.
Yeah.
I mean, you had to pick him up and carry him off the stage and someone had to take over. When you've done it a while, it becomes easier. And it's one of the things I always recommend to junior engineers. Practice writing things. To me, I quite enjoy. Well, I do enjoy it, but even if you don't really enjoy it, practice it, because being able to write and being able to speak publicly opens doors to you. I mean, I've been fortunate enough to travel the world with somebody else paying the bill, which really is the only way to do it. If you have a choice. So I mean, I would never have got to walk on the Great Wall of China if it hadn't been for writing and speaking. And I've got friends who used to create memory slave stores for mainframe computers 30 or 40 years ago. And they're still doing memory stores, maybe in modern technologies and things. And they're experts at memory and hashing algorithms and caching logic and all that stuff. But they're still in the cubicle. I mean, the cubicle they're in gets smaller and smaller and further away. The cobwebs mount as you approach them. It's like the professor in Independence Day, where he says they don't let us out very often. But I know people like that. And I know people who are like, well, classic in every sense. I mean, I've got a friend whose name I won't mention. But if it wasn't for the fact he was married, I mean, he's got a brain the size of a planet. So I mean, Stephen Hawking type, well, not maybe there, but reminiscent of that sort of power. But if his wife didn't make sure he got his shoes on before he left the house, he probably wouldn't. Because he's on a different plane to the rest of us. And I also know the classic engineers, the joke, how do you know if an engineer is an extrovert or an introvert? And if he's an extrovert, he looks at your shoes when he's talking to you rather than his own. Yeah.
I like that. I'm going to have to use that.
But I mean, so I know people like that, and I feel blessed that I don't have that problem. Like I say, the trick, much like with my mother, is to get us to stop talking. And it does... as long as you've got something worth talking about, it's always nice to know your subject as well. But once, because I once had to give somebody else's presentation, one of those last minute things. Somebody's taken sick. Here's the presentation. Go and give it. And you have no idea. You come over as a bumbling idiot. Now, with my own presentation, one of the things. There are places you can go on the internet to learn how to give presentations. And one of the things that you don't do is death by bullets. You know,
Yeah.
here are 50 points.
Thank
and
you.
then they read through them.
Thank you.
And I'm a fast reader, so they're still on line 1, and I finish the slide, and I'm like, what's next? So when I do a presentation, it's just imagery, or predominantly imagery. There might be a summary slide,
Okay.
but there's a picture. And usually the picture is not exactly what you might expect, but it's more an aid to memory for me. So I know what the flow is. So when I see that picture, I know what I'm going to talk about. And as I talk about it, then the picture makes sense in the context of the talk. And I like to, again, sprinkle talks with nuggets of trivia, dates, times. This guy did this on this date. Yeah, to give a sense of the history of things. So 6 o'clock in the morning, before I'm giving you a talk, if you look out in the parking lot of the hotel, you'll see me wandering around with my notes. And based on one side, there's a list of dates, and on the other side, there's a list of facts. And I just go backwards and forwards, looking at a date and saying, what's the fact for that date? Looking at a fact, what's the date for that fact? Just making sure I've got them to hand. Because again, when I'm speaking, I don't want to be looking at notes, you know, reading a script. Because when you try to read a script, it comes over as very wooden. You know, if you've just got a few bullet points and you've practiced it in your head, then it's so much easier.
How many, I want to be respectful of your time too. I know that you have to go. Have you got a couple more minutes?
Oh, sure, yeah.
You talked about the morning of walking around in the parking lot, sort of going over things. Before then, do you rehearse the speech before you actually get to the date of?
Not really, unless it's something like in May of this year, Jacob Benningo, who I'm not sure if you're familiar with, he's a much younger engineer than me, but he's got his own Benningo Engineering, and he hosted the Embedded Online Conference, and that was a talk that was supposed to take an hour, and it was pre-recorded, but I practiced that just for timing sake. So not per se. I mean, you get a feel for it now. The thing is, they always say one slide every 2 minutes or something. Mm-hmm. And basically, I could have one slide and talk for an hour over it. Or a lot of my presentations typically have maybe 45 or 50 slides.
Wow.
That's because, yeah, but that's because a lot of the time, remember, it's just imagery. Mm-hmm. It's not, you know, lots of words. So a lot of the time, the image might come up, and again, it's to trigger my thoughts, and I might say a few words, and it's no more than 10 seconds. And then on to the next slide. So it's keeping it going. So you get a feel for how many slides you can fit in a certain time. So it's not so much rehearsing the speech. It's just making sure I've got the facts down. Yeah, because I always take it, it's almost like if I'm writing a white paper for a company where I've interviewed them, and I know the technology, and I know where it all fits in, but sometimes you're not quite sure where to start. And I'll go and get my friend Bob from the office behind here and drag him into the conference room where there's a whiteboard. And I'll sit him down and I'll say, Bob, I'm going to tell you about, you know, this technology. And I'll start off on the board. And I know he knows nothing about technology whatsoever. Yeah, I'm still teaching him how to use his new smartphone. Every day he'll stick his head through the door going, how do I make a call? Or how do I stop making a call? Every time I press this button, it does a FaceTime with my sister, because that's what we did last time and stuff. But I'll sit him down and I'll say, okay, we're talking, I published a paper today about a new PCB process. Okay. And I might sit him down and say, okay, I'm going to tell you about this new process for laser etching PCBs. let's start at the beginning. A printed circuit board is, and this is the way you traditionally make it. You know, you get a board, it's covered in a layer of copper, you put a film on it, you image it, you remove the unwanted resist, you etch it. Now, this is what the new process does. And I was like, right, thanks, Bob. I've got the flow. I know how I'm going to present it or write about it. And so that, to me, that's the big thing. Half of the presentation I'll give will be creating the slides, because I'll be thinking about it in my head, how I'm going to, well, I'll jot down a list of subjects I want to cover. Then I'll find the imagery that will go with that. And then I'll swap them around to make the flow go better. And then I'll look at it and think, this is going to go for too long. Which bits am I going to chop out? And that can be the hardest thing, actually, getting rid of things that you really want to talk about because they're so cool. But you're there for a purpose. And it's the same with the magazine article as well. Very often, somebody says, I want 1,000 words on something. And I write about it, and it's 2,000 words. But they only wanted 1,000, and they've got a specific reason for wanting that 1,000. And it's amazing, actually. I mean, really, you can go through 2,000 words and boil it down to 500 if you have to, and just get the salient points across.
Uh-huh.
You know, the trick is to be able to force yourself to get rid of something that you thought was particularly droll, that you really wanted to put in there, but it's not really necessary. Blaise Pascal, who created one of the first mechanical calculators, is famous for, he'd written a letter to his friend, and at the end he said, if I had had more time, I would have written you a shorter letter.
I think I've heard that. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's very true. Yeah, it's easy. Well, for me, it's easy to write lots of words. It's hard to go back through them and pare them down.
Well, down. One final question, because I know we're running out of time. You say this, that I guess this sort of comes naturally to you now. Did you ever have to, or did you ever take a course on speaking or writing, or did you just?
I never did, and I'm sure it would have benefited me a lot.
You seem to be doing fine without it.
Well, I mean, again, I've been very lucky. I mean, you know, the outrageous good looks, the incredible sense of dress. Well, that's a funny thing as well, because when I came over to Intergraph, and this is 1990, so it's 30 years ago as we speak, probably 30 years ago to the day, thinking about it.
Wow.
Well, give or take a few days. But it was, I think it was August 1990, so, a couple of weeks, 30 years and a couple of weeks. And at that time, the dress code was business attire. Shirts, ties, slacks, and so on. Fridays, you're allowed to come in without a jacket and without a tie. Casual Fridays.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I was like 33 at the time, and you just accepted that as the way things were. Now, and then when I left Intergraph in 2000, and I started, doing the freelance stuff, I got a gig. I was the opening act, the warm-up act for Newt Gingrich, presenting at a technical conference in Hawaii. And I went over there, and I just draw fairly dull clothing. And in Hawaii, the newscasters are wearing Hawaiian shirts, and everyone's wearing Hawaiian shirts. They just look so colourful and bright. So I brought a few and brought them back with me. And I started wearing Hawaiian shirts, and I liked them. And I was freelance, and mostly I'm in my office on my own. The door's shut. I don't see anyone for weeks. Well, I mean, it sounds a bit bad, but I mean, obviously I go home and I've got a wife and son and everything. But so in the morning, I think I've got 2 or 3 T-shirts I use for gardening, and that's it. And Hawaiian shirts. And so in the morning, the first choice of the day is which shirt for the day. I mean, if that's the worst choice, I mean, it's already a happy day. You've chosen a shirt that makes you happy for the day.
Nice.
And now if a company says we want you to present on a webinar or come out and give a keynote speech, like, again, I don't know how it happens, but it's quite nice that I've been invited to give guest lectures at universities like Oslo University. or keynote speeches in Norway for an FPGA conference and things. But they know what they get. It's going to be me in my jeans and Hawaiian shirt. You know, because that's what I do these days. You know, I'm old enough now that I can wear what I want.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You've earned that right.
But again, I would absolutely recommend to any young engineers, you know, to practice writing, you know, join a writing group or something. Just practice writing stories. If you don't want to write technical, you know, at least learn the basics of the English language if you're speaking English. And I'm not being disparaging there, but
you'd be surprised.
I get articles submitted. Well, when I was an editor at E-Times, not now because I just do my own writing, but when I was an editor at E-Times and embedded.com, you get article submissions from people. And obviously, a non-native speaker is going to have problems with some aspects of English because it is a bit convoluted sometimes. But even native English speakers can be very, very bad at it. I've got a friend who shall remain nameless, who is like director of engineering at a massive aerospace company. And he still doesn't know the difference between it's and it's with or without an apostrophe and your with or without an apostrophe. And it's like I always say, if somebody sends me an email saying you're an idiot, but they spell it Y-O-U-R, it's not conveying the message they were hoping for.
That's awesome.
And you could spend the rest of your life learning. I mean, there's some grammatical rules in English that are so convoluted, even grammarians cannot agree on them. So trying to work on those is not going to help you.
Yeah.
Because the engineering audience wouldn't know a split infinitive if it crawled up the leg and bit them. Just learn it's and you're and you're halfway there. Yeah. So there's that. Learn basic English and practice writing because it gets more fluid and everything. And if you're not confident with public speaking, there's an amazing organization, not that I've been, but I've heard about it, called the Toastmasters.
Right.
And you can join that, and they won't drag you on the stage screaming, but they'll get, you know, encourage you to write a little something and present it to the rest of them. And because they're all presenting to each other, it feels less threatening. And I've heard wonderful things about them. I mean, if nothing else, you know, if you're invited to be a best man at someone's wedding, it's nice to have to be able to stand up without passing out. Although it certainly gives them something to talk about.
Yes. Yes. All right. Wow, that's a lot. I'm going to stop it there because again, and I want to be respectful of your time.
I did warn you.
No. I wish we had more time. Maybe someday we'll have you come back and do
part two. Part deux.
Part deux, yes. But thank you. No, this is very good. It's very valuable, and I do appreciate you taking the time. You've given me a lot of insight, a lot of good things to share.
When you go back over this, you're going to be thinking, I was going to ask him about electronics, and we ended up in Belgium in the Second World War.
Well, more than electronics, the reason, like I said, I focus on you is because you're not just smart, you're able to communicate. And that, I think, is a rare skill, sadly. And everything you talked about today just sort of reinforced what I was thinking. So, but I do appreciate the advice. I think a lot of engineers could benefit from it. So once again, I thank you very, very much profusely, if I'm allowed to use that word.
Oh, yes.
For joining me today. And I look forward to it. I'm serious. I think it'd be beneficial to have you come back again another time and give us another episode.
I'd love to. There's nothing I like more than talking about myself.
Well, we will accommodate you then.
Oh, and I've just realised that if you've heard a little chirping sound in the background, I should have turned it off. I've got a Geiger counter. I just realised it's tweaking away in the background there. So sorry about that. If everyone's been listening to this going, what's that sound? Then it's my fault. I won't do it again.
Well, I'm worried that it's even detecting anything.
Oh, there's always occasional cosmic rays and things. Some of the energy cosmic rays ferociously powerful, and then they get secondary radiation coming down. And there's radiation all around us. I mean, yeah, a limited amount. But just to make sure, I do have some radioactive marbles.
That's awesome.
You got time for one little story?
Absolutely, yeah, yeah.
So I read a little hobby magazine, hobby electronics magazine, and there was a do-it-yourself Geiger counter. So I bought the parts and I made it, and I turned it on, and it didn't do anything. And then I thought, is it not doing anything because it's not working, or is it not doing anything because I have no source of radiation?
Right, right.
Bit of a conundrum. So I called up this nuclear power station 15 miles away, which is why I wanted the Geiger counter in the first place. So I called them up and said, can I come down with my Geiger counter to test your radiation, see if it works? Because I want to know if there's an explosion anytime. And they're very accommodating, to be honest with you. Sadly disappointed by the response. So I wrote a blog about it, and a friend of mine in Australia, David Ashton, who's a brilliant engineer, sent me an email going, if you ship it over to me in Australia, I'll take a look at it for you, which I thought was really kind for him because apparently he'd done some stuff with that before. So I put it in a box, and I went down to the post office, and I sent it off to Australia. Came back, and there's a package for me on my desk that someone had brought in and stuck on my desk. So I opened it up, and it's radioactive marbles. And there's a note that said, sorry to hear that you've got this Geiger counter, but no radioactive source. Please have a pair of my radioactive marbles. So it was one of those funny days where you start the morning with the Geiger counter, but no radioactive source. So you end the day with no Geiger counter, but radioactive source.
You're the only person I know who would have radioactive marbles in his possession. That's awesome.
Yes, yeah, they're over there. They're only low grade, right? I mean, I wouldn't carry them around in my pants pockets all day, but they are only low grade. But yeah, so I don't even notice the Geiger counter now. A friend of mine, another friend, Vince Mazer of Mazer Electronics, he started making these really cool Geiger counters. So that's what we're cheaping here. And he sent me one. And so I've done some interesting experiments trying to get through airport security with the beeping in my backpack.
I was about to ask.
Well, the thing is, I wondered what's the radiation like when you're on an aeroplane high up. Not thinking that, sometimes as engineers, we tend to get a little bit distracted. I have another friend in New Zealand, whose name shall remain nameless to protect the innocent. But he was playing around with FPGAs, and he thought to himself that if he toddled, he got one with a high frequency clock. Mm-hmm. He thought that he could toddle it fast enough to generate radio frequencies in Morse code. Oh, so nice. He decided to send himself a message and then go down with a radio detector, wandering around, see how far it transmitted. Guess what message he decided to transmit?
SOS?
Yes. What sort of lunatic would start transmitting SOS just to see if he could detect it from a long way away? Unfortunately, somebody could. And they triangulated on him. And he was surprised. It never struck him. So like I say, engineers, you have to know as if to lovers. So as I say, I apologize for the chirping. I don't notice it anymore. I'll notice it when it suddenly starts going beep, 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 beep.
Yeah, I would worry when it starts chirping that fast, yeah.
But this is just typical background radiation, so no need to worry.
Wow. Now I'm worried. Now I'm thinking I should have one here just to see what background radiation I have around.
Well, Mazer Instruments, absolutely recommended.
Duly noted. Well, thank you again, Max. I appreciate it greatly. Keep writing because I'm enjoying what you're writing, and I'm sure other engineers will.
I'm not allowed to stop. I write for food.
I like that. We'll write for food.
Or bacon sandwiches.
Or bacon sandwiches. Either one. Okay. Well, I'm going to stop recording there.
Okay. Thanks so much.